Are we ready? All right. Good evening, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us. My name is Christina Sinclair, Director at Edinburgh World Heritage, and we are delighted to be hosting this event. As you know, this is one of a series of online events that we at Edinburgh World Heritage are hosting with important national figures to discuss some of the key issues we face as a valued historic city in the 21st century. For those of you who are new to Edinburgh World Heritage, welcome. We're an independent charity with the aim of ensuring that people are engaged with their shared heritage of the city and that this is a dynamic force that benefits everyone. We believe that heritage is hugely important in its own right and makes a valuable wider contribution to the economy, environment and social values of Scotland. And with that in mind, tonight we open the floor to a very important question. Can heritage be part of the solution to Edinburgh's climate emergency? A question particularly important given the huge proportion of historic buildings and spaces in the city and the contribution they already make to the sustainability of the city in terms of embodied energy and the importance of effective and sensitive measures to make sure their daily use is more sustainable. And of course, particularly timely now during Scottish Climate Week. Quick bit of housekeeping. You won't be able to unmute yourselves during the evening or turn on your cameras. This is to allow us to ensure that the cameras and audio are focused on our hosts and guests. However, we'd like to ask our panelists, if you'd like to ask our panelists some questions from the floor during the evening, and thanks to those of you who have already sent in questions. If you have something you'd like to put to our guests or make a comment about anything you've heard, please do so using the Q&A function. My colleague Jan will be moderating the chat and will come into the conversation at various points. If you're having any technical issues, please let us know in the chat window and we will do our best to accommodate you. My colleague Rebecca is on hand to help with these issues. Please also be aware that this event is being recorded. So if you do want to catch our discussion at a later time, you'll be able to do so. Please keep an eye on our social media channels for links to this. We are on Twitter with the handle, as you can see there, at Edinburgh WH, Facebook with the / Edinburgh World Heritage, and of course on Instagram as well, at Edinburgh World Heritage. Now, important to talk about donations. The coronavirus outbreak is having a major impact on many charities in the UK and around the world. Quite apart from the devastating human cost of the disease, the pandemic is also causing a significant financial impact, which threatens the crucial work of many charities. At Edinburgh World Heritage, fundraising events have had to be cancelled. Our World Heritage exhibition and retail operation at the Tron has been closed, and many of our important conservation work has had to be postponed. As a result, we expect to lose an important part of our income this year. And while we make every effort to cut our cloth according to our size, the reality is that we, like others, face a significant financial shortfall. We therefore ask our friends and supporters to help us get through this period of uncertainty. If you support our conservation work and community work in Edinburgh, then please consider becoming one of our supporters tonight. We've made this very easy. You can donate via text. Just text the word Edinburgh WH with the amount you wish to donate to 70450. If you'd like to donate, for example, £6, which is the cost of a normal member's ticket for an event, then text Edinburgh WH 6 to 70450. And if you'd like to become a member and support our conservation work in the city, then go to ewh.org.uk/members. Now, on to the main event. We are delighted to welcome key figures to contribute to this discussion. I will now hand over to my colleague Nick, who will chair what I'm sure will be a fantastic discussion. Enjoy.
Thank you, Christina. So joining us tonight, we have Anna Beswick, who joined sustainability charity Sniffer in 2009 and manages the Adaptation Scotland programme, which provides advice and support to help Scotland be prepared for and resilient to the effects of climate change. In 2015, Anna helped to establish the Edinburgh Adapts initiative, which led to the first Edinburgh Action Plan, containing 100 committed adaptation actions, and the Edinburgh Vision Plan, which sets out our adaptation aims for two key landmark dates in the future, 2025 and 2050. Ewan Hyslop's also with us. We're delighted that Ewan's joined us. He has degrees in geology and geochemistry and an MSc in architectural conservation. He joined Historic Scotland in 2010, having been manager for building stone research and consultancy with the British Geological Survey, specialising in the analysis, selection and performance of building stone. In his role as Head of Technical Research and Science at Historic Environment Scotland, he manages programmes on technical buildings, research, digital research and innovation, heritage science, and oversees the agency's climate change programme. Ewan is co-chair of the International Climate Heritage Network and chair of the Climate Change Working Group under the Scottish Government Strategy for the Historic Environment. So welcome to Ewan. Adam McVey is joining us, familiar face. Adam is from Paisley and grew up in Renfrew and has a background in economics and international law. Adam's worked for an accountancy firm, social investment charity, the Fringe Festival, and for leading human rights charity. Adam was first elected to the City of Edinburgh Council in 2012 and served as the city's transport vice convener for 3 years. He became the city's youngest ever council leader in 2017, representing Leith. Adam is also the leader of the SNP group in the city and chairs the Edinburgh Community Partnership Board, and formerly chaired the Edinburgh City Region Deal Committee. In February 2020, he was appointed as Vice Chair of the Edinburgh Climate Commission, which aims to accelerate action and impact on climate change in the city. Fiona Rankin is an architect who joined Edinburgh World Heritage in 2009 after working in private practice for over 20 years, focusing on the conservation and adaptive reuse of historic buildings. At EWH, Fiona leads the development and delivery of projects conserving and enhancing often neglected areas of public realm, historic public realm, and which can involve lighting, sculpture, monuments, public art, community gardens, graveyards, interpretation, or research. Fiona was a leading figure in the 12 Monuments project, which Edinburgh World Heritage led with the City of Edinburgh Council, which saw the conservation of St Bernard's Well, the Burns Monuments, and many others. And she is now what we like to call the Queen of the Closes and is leading our efforts to turn these sometimes insalubrious spaces into valued and pleasant public spaces in Edinburgh. So welcome everyone to our guests. And we'd like to start really by setting the scene and thinking about weather and climate change in Edinburgh. Edinburgh's always been known for its terrible climate, going back to Robert Louis Stevenson, and others have always commented on that. What are we seeing at the moment? And what can we expect in terms of actual change to weather patterns in Edinburgh? And we'll kick off with Anna on that question.
Hi, good evening, everybody. Thanks for that introduction, Nick. So yeah, actually, how is Scotland's climate changing and what can we expect in the decades ahead? So we've certainly seen over the last century some really significant changes in global climate, and that's reflected in what we've experienced in Scotland and here in Edinburgh. So over the long term, we're seeing increases in temperature. So the temperature in Scotland has increased by around 0.7 of a degree over the last 40 to 50 years. And that might seem kind of, what does that mean? That's been enough to extend our growing season by 5 weeks compared to the growing season that we had back in the 1960s, for example. And so those kind of changes are really, really significant. We're also seeing significant changes in rainfall as well. So overall average increases in rainfall across all seasons, but particularly significant increases in winter rainfall. And probably fresh in many of our minds as the storm that we experienced very recently in the city. And those kind of really intense, heavy rainfall events are also a characteristic of our changing climate. So it's not just about increases in rainfall, it's about increases in intense rainfall events as well. So those are some of the things I should also mention, not forgetting sea level rise We're seeing sea level rise around the UK, around Scotland's coastline. So those observed changes are projected to continue and intensify in the decades ahead. In fact, we're expecting the changes that we'll experience in our climate to be unlike anything that we've seen before. So we have vital work to do to both adapt to the unavoidable impacts of climate change, because some of these changes are locked into our climate system because of recent past and present day emissions. So we have to face up to those, respond, increase resilience and adapt. And importantly, we really have to redouble our efforts to reduce greenhouse gas emissions to try and limit the extent of future change. So I hope that gives you a flavour of what we've experienced and what we're likely to experience in future.
I think that's excellent. And I'm sure there's probably consensus among panelists that that's pretty much the picture. So we can probably move on, having established that climate and weather patterns are changing in the city, and think about the impact that that will have on Edinburgh, on its buildings, on its infrastructure, and on its communities. And maybe we'll start with asking Fiona to comment on that question in terms of the impact on Edinburgh.
Well, the most obvious impact will be with the rainfall. The increased intensity of rainfall is, as Anna said, something that we haven't seen before, and it's something that's going to affect our buildings in a very serious way. The capacity for roofs to capture all of that and transmit it through the gutters into our sewage system, it will need to be increased, and we'll see people having to put bigger gutters, and we'll have to deal with flooding and drainage in local spots around the city. The drainage question is actually a very serious question, because in recent years we've covered so much of the city in hard materials that are not porous that we already have quite bad problems with being able to get rid of surface water.
Right.
In terms
Maybe
of
just
structure,
open up to others as well at that point, Fiona. So we've got there's issues with drainage, with roofing, etc. Ewan, what other impacts are you seeing in terms of climate change in the city?
Sure. I think we're hearing about average changes, which are significant. It's wetter, it's warmer, we've got less frost, etc. But some of these extreme events, their intensity and their frequency, I think are some of the most challenging issues that we face in terms of managing the impacts of climate change in the city. We know these trends are set to continue. Average figures don't tell the whole story because they mask some of that variability in those extremes, and we're predicted to see extremes in various directions. So both heat waves and heavy rainfall events are predicted to be more likely. We've all experienced some significant extreme events recently. Just a couple of weeks ago in August, we had that terrible storm event with the thunder and lightning, and 83% of the month's rainfall fell in 2 hours, which overwhelmed many of the existing systems that we have in place to cope with rainwater management. And so one of the things that we need to do is to plan for extreme events, using some of this climate data that we've got, which is very good, make better informed decisions about how we manage these impacts.
One of the things we see as we're walking around the city obviously is increased erosion of the stone, increased growth of vegetation in gutters and on roofs and so on. Do you think that's a major issue from a conservation point of view?
Yeah, I think all these different climate impacts will make a difference. Some of them are a sort of longer burn, some of them are more intense. Increasing temperature and moisture it means that we're seeing more issues with managing vegetation on buildings. So the maintenance of buildings in terms of cleaning out gutters is more of an issue. Anna mentioned that the growing season has expanded, increased by about 5 weeks over the last few decades, and that means the vegetation colonization of buildings is higher. Intensity of sun can affect UV light, can affect bitumen roofs, for example, felt roofs, the durability of paints and renders. The impact of rain is obviously significant in terms of saturation of porous sandstone.
Right.
And and the combination of all these things, extreme events with wind, can affect vulnerable parts of buildings like chimneys, with the potential for structural damage.
Right, Adam, are you seeing other impacts? We talked about the impact on buildings. What other impacts are you seeing as Vice Chair of the Climate Commission?
There's huge impacts on the economy, particularly of extreme weather events. It can affect a whole host of parts of the city that maybe people didn't think of before. But there are some, I was going to say positives. There are some sort of swings and roundabouts impacts that you might not have thought about as well. Public transport revenue, for example, obviously not in COVID times because all the normal rules are sort of out the window. But on a normal wet Tuesday, as I would say, public transport revenues can be heavily influenced by the weather. It'll influence people's choices of how they're getting around the city. And obviously what we've seen in the last 6 months is a very different model of how people are working, how people are getting around the city anyway. Not to bring everything down to water and surface water, but we have seen across the city and region an inability for that infrastructure to cope with that large concentrated rainfall. And the impacts right now have been mercifully limited to fairly localised areas in the city and fairly easy to clean up issues like water overflow into the water leak, for example, from the sewage system. These things are relatively easy in the grand scheme of things to solve, but they will become more frequent, they will become more difficult, and we have to make sure the infrastructure, we cannot in the space of even a few years update the water infrastructure in the entire city to cope with those kind of events. So we have to get better at anticipating them and finding easier, quicker interventions, at least in the short term to medium term, so that we can adapt and make sure they're not causing huge issues to people's properties and other things.
Right, thank you. So the questions and the comments are coming in. Comment from Bill Balfour. I have come across a situation in the new town where it appears that the intensity of rain over a short period overwhelmed the drainage system, resulting in serious flooding. This could be a major problem for the future. So let's turn now, I guess, to what the city is planning and proposing to do about all this, and how it compares to the UK and the Scottish government. Maybe I should say Adam is really taking part as Vice Chair of the Climate Commission, but I'll come back to you first then, Adam, on that question of what the city is doing, the broad outline of what the plan is and how it differs to what the UK and Scottish governments are recommending.
Sure, well, I would hope that there's a lot of synergy between what the council's doing and what both governments are doing, although there is some different net zero by 2030. So looking at those mitigating measures, which are really all about our individual responsibility and our collective as a city, and how we both meet that responsibility to the planet and future generations, but also to ourselves. We're literally discussing right now the serious impacts that climate change and the impact of climate change is having on our infrastructure today, not some point in the future. So the mitigating measures are absolutely crucial to that. As well as being Vice Chair of the Climate Commission, I've recently started sitting on the COP26 body with the UK government and mayors and council leaders from across the UK, to try and work out what synergy, again, there is and what learning there is from a city perspective right across the 4 nations. It's worth saying, I think, in terms of our plans as a city, we are far more focused on mitigation than we are adaptation. It's not lost on anyone that we will have to adapt to the increasing changes, but it is more important that we deal with the issue as it is, and the issue and the cause of climate change is carbon emissions, and that's the thing that as a city we need to grasp with. So our focus in the Climate Commission, in the council, in the city, and I hope in governments at all levels, is far more focused on mitigation, where we can remove the cause of this change or deal with the cause of this change as much as we possibly can, as quick as we possibly can, and yes, deal with the adaptation. But that's not where our efforts and resources should be primarily focused. They should be primarily focused at securing the long-term future and security of, one, our planet, and two, our own city and our own communities.
Right. Maybe I'm going to just turn to Anna here. Maybe just ask her to tease out, just for everyone's clarity, the difference between the mitigation and adaptation, because everyone's using those words. Just want to make sure that everyone who's joined us this evening understands the difference between those two things, and any perspective that you have on as the queen of the various adaptation plans and mitigation plans, any comments you would have on Edinburgh.
Sure, thanks, Nick. Yeah, so just to hopefully clarify what the difference is between climate change adaptation and mitigation. So as Adam was describing, there's an urgent need to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and that work is commonly referred to as climate change mitigation, where we're trying to limit and drastically reduce the amount of greenhouse gases that are being emitted into the atmosphere, so that we can hopefully limit the extent of future climate change. And that's really, really important work. I wholeheartedly agree with Adam that that's vital. Adapting to climate change is actually around facing up to the reality that our climate is already changing significantly. That it's some of these changes are irreversible because of what we've already done in the past and because of what we're doing today. And our work within Adaptation Scotland is to ensure that we do face up to the inevitable, that we are investing wisely to ensure that actually when we're investing in new infrastructure, that we're building it with current and future climate in mind. We're not designing it so that it would work if we were back in the 1960s, because if we do that, we're just going to be wasting our money. It's like building on sand. We need to face up to the reality of the challenges that we're facing, so that where we're making investments using scarce resources to develop and regenerate and see our city flourish, that actually the decisions we're making are based on the reality of the climate that we now face. So that includes everything from maybe having to reconsider the size of drain pipes on some historic buildings. I know that's hugely contentious. I wouldn't like to claim to be an expert, but just for this audience, right through to actually where we plan and design and allow the building of new homes to take place. So that, I hope, gives you a flavour of the difference between adaptation and mitigation.
That's great.
And the reality and the urgency of this challenge. It's not a challenge that can be ignored for another day. It's with us, and it's increasingly with us.
Just lots of comments coming through about the importance of maintenance. Fiona, Rankin, are we doing enough maintenance, bread and butter work in the city in terms of, I guess, adaptation and mitigation? You're on mute, Fiona.
The basic answer to that is no, we're not doing enough maintenance. Just taking a quick walk through the city, you can see that there is a lack of maintenance in a lot of places. People will need to start taking maintenance a lot more seriously. We know that buildings that are not well maintained actually use more electricity, in that they lose heat through damp walls and that sort of thing. And it's very important to keep up with the maintenance, not only to prevent water getting in and to be prepared for these extreme weather events, but to reduce electricity use. So maintenance actually is the very first step that everyone can take to deal with buildings and their contribution to greenhouse gases.
Right. Yeah, so let's turn to the historic environment at this point. I think it's worth pointing out that buildings and private homes and tenements and offices are the biggest single contributor. I'm looking at Anna for a reassuring nod here. The biggest single contributor in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, and I think transportation is then comes second in terms of aspects of city life which needs to be mitigated against. So we're thinking now about the historic environment. And the World Heritage Site, 4,500 buildings, many of them listed. The historic environment is sometimes criticised as being part of the problem when it comes to climate change, both adaptation and mitigation. So we want to really explore that issue and see how we can be part of the solution. So I'll turn to Ewan at this point and ask, why are there mixed opinions about the significance and role of the historic environment when it comes to climate change? You're on mute too. I think we've lost you in sound. Maybe we'll turn to Fiona just to comment on that. Why just briefly, why is it that the historic environment is sometimes seen as the problem?
Well, compared to new buildings that we can build and insulate to very high standards, people see historic buildings as using a lot of energy. But in fact, they are very sustainable in their own right. They use local materials. They don't use cement and concrete that is vastly wasteful of carbon. And because they can be quite easily adapted and upgraded for to help save energy, we believe that they can actually be part of the solution compared to the problem.
Have we got you back there, Ewan?
Yes, I hope so. Okay.
Fiona answered it very clearly, but do you have anything to add in terms of the role of the historic environment?
Yeah, I wasn't dodging your difficult question. I was remotely muted by someone else there, I think. Well, I mean, for me, if climate change action and dealing with climate change is about addressing sustainability, and it is, it's about, at its sort of biggest, it's about sustaining our lives, it's about sustaining society, our environment, our infrastructure, our buildings, places, and as Adam said, our economy and our jobs, then the historic environment is right at the heart of that. Because places like Edinburgh historic places have changed and evolved right through time, continually adapting to our changing needs and requirements. And by definition, they are sustainable places. They have proved to be resilient. And addressing climate change means that we need to continue that process of adaptation and of change. And that's about shaping the city in a way that makes it fit for the future, but retains the essential attributes that we value and that contribute so much to our lives and to our economy.
Do you agree with that, Adam? Do you see the historic environment in Edinburgh as part of the solution to this, or an issue to be overcome?
Well, it's both. There are benefits of having such a historic centre and such synergy, because it means when you're finding the right solutions for that community, if you think of the Newtown, for example, you're broadly looking at the same sort of solutions for that space, which helps you club together models like district heating, if that's appropriate, and other things together, rather than looking at a whole kind of cherry pick multitude of things. But there's no getting away from some of the challenges that it brings. So take a really solid example, and this is an area Scotland's had a lot of success in, decarbonising electricity. If you want to put solar panels up in the city, it's a much more arduous process right now to do it on a historic building than it is a newer building that's not in a conservation area. and there are things like that 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 will be choices. There'll be choices about what we can live with, what our tolerance is in trying to meet that that carbon target and get to where we need to go. And it's, you know, it's not a choice; it's a need. So it's both. It provides, I think, a good solid underpinning of one, the city, and, you know, love it or hate it. And I don't think I've met anybody on the planet who hates our city centre. I think everybody falls in love with it who comes here. You know, that's what we have. That's what we have to work with. We have to find the right solutions for our buildings, but there will be some give in that, some give about how we cope with additional rainfall within that historic setting, and how we make sure that when you have an environment, and we do in our historic centre that is predominantly cobbled and stone buildings, and there's not that basin to absorb quite as much water as you know, Holyrood Park or the Meadows or anywhere else, or even just a normal sort of housing estate with relatively smaller houses and everyone with their own garden. You know, these are issues to overcome, but they're not insurmountable, and they require a bit of thinking. But I think the benefit going for it is the synergy of how our both Newtown and Old Town have developed, and I think that gives us a lot of common ground for looking at those solutions and pulling them together and making them economically viable, which is one of the things that can hold back some major projects and driving down carbon emissions.
So if you raise one of the big themes, which is how we get that balance right between conservation and change in terms of implementing the steps necessary in terms of our response. So let's open that question up. Maybe start with Fiona on that, as a conservation architect and as someone who's worked for many years in the conservation of the city. How, from your perspective, others may have a different point of view, so everyone chip in. How do we get the balance right between protecting heritage and implementing change?
I think the first thing to understand is what we've actually got. And many buildings, when we do conservation work or changes and adaptations, we do what's called a conservation plan, which means that we look at the significance, the architectural significance, the cultural significance, the historical significance, and we put all these things together, and it allows us to make properly informed decisions. But we don't necessarily have all that information, let's say, for a street or a park. So I think the first thing really is understand what we've got, and then that allows us to see where we can make changes and which parts are more precious or we would lose value if we altered. And I think working together, we'll be able to design changes that can actually enhance and complement the World Heritage status. So for instance, we know that we want to reduce car traffic and increase accessibility to the city centre via public transport, so that more people can enjoy the city centre. And you can imagine that a city centre with far less traffic is going to be a far more pleasant environment. You're going to be able to see the architecture better, be able to enjoy it more easily. So there's a lot of opportunities here to, when we're making these changes, to actually make really good improvements at the same time, declutter the streets, make them, you know, use placemaking to make much better places that people will want to come on foot, that people will be able to cycle through safely. So, you know, I don't see these two things as being in conflict. I think we just have to work together and through informed knowledge of what we're dealing with.
Anna, just turn to you on that. Do you think Fiona's going far enough there? Do you see traditional buildings in Edinburgh, whether they're tenements or houses or shops and so on, do you think they are intrinsically sustainable as people in the heritage sector would like to think? Or do you think we need to go further in terms of maybe breaking some of the traditional conventions and rules as a part of our adaptation and mitigation efforts?
I suppose what I think about the whole challenge is around the need for deepening understanding and compromise, and for moving outside of silos, for respecting different perspectives, but ultimately there will have to be some, we will have to do things differently. We're going to be able to reduce emissions and adapt in the way that we need to. So I couldn't comment on the specifics around what intervention's right or what that balance is. I just think the fact that we're here tonight having this conversation, that so many people have joined us, is actually a really important signal around we need to be having these difficult conversations. The way we've done things in the past won't deliver the kind of future that we all want to see. There will have to be compromise all round, but I'm quite sure that Edinburgh's historic environment is an integral part of what makes this city resilient. It's at the heart of our heritage. It's in our hearts in terms of what we love about this city as well, and it has to be integral to the way that we respond to this challenge.
Right. Ewan, just turn to you on this one. How far do you think we can go in terms of adapting historic structures and well-loved buildings to make them more fuel efficient and to play a more positive role in the climate response?
Well, the first thing to say is it's a balance, and it's about, as Fiona says, understanding what we've got and what we value. And you know, I think it's true to say there's not one historic building in Edinburgh that's the same now as it was when it was built. These buildings have always been adapted, they've always changed. Think of sanitation, electrification, introduction of gas, etc. They've continually had to evolve to suit our requirements. But at the same time, it's about identifying the precious attributes of what we have, both as individual buildings and as a collective space. Those values are significant to the people who live in Edinburgh and visit Edinburgh. Our historic places are key alongside our culture to our identity. Where we come from in the past tells us who we are as a people and where we go. So the economic value in terms of tourism, I mean, I think about 75% of the visitors that come to Edinburgh cite culture and history as the reason that they're there. So it's about understanding these important values and not throwing the baby out with the bathwater, but at the same time being able to change and move forward and adapt these buildings, which incidentally by their nature have a lot of resilience. I mean, the fact that many of these properties are 100, 200 years old, you know, says a lot about their resilience and adaptability already. So I don't think we should shy away from having these discussions and facing the fact that they're not pickled in a jar, these buildings. You know, they have to be fit for the future.
Excellent. Okay. Well, we seem to have a consensus that it's about balance and it's about some compromise, which is all good. So I'm going to turn to Jan at this point. Jan is working at Edinburgh World Heritage as our climate response manager. I'm going to bring him in now, and he's going to just give us a quick update on what's been happening on the Q&A.
Yes, thanks very much, Nick. Yeah, we've received a lot of questions and comments, and thanks very much for this. Remember that you can send us your questions using the Q&A button. So on the main topics that have been discussed, very much we've got a lot of comments on the drainage problems and the flooding issues all around the city. For instance, Gillian and Don were commenting on the fact that green roofs and green spaces could help with absorbing these increased rainfalls. There were also comments on problems about hard landscaping, such as asphalt, that is increasing the problem, you know, in relation to flooding. Another aspect that was discussed amongst the attendees is about maintenance and the problems in relation to maintenance in Edinburgh. And Norris said that building maintenance needs to be managed firmly, particularly in tenements. And he was mentioning the crucial role of owners in that regards. And finally, we received a lot of comments and questions on the right balance between managing change and maintaining heritage values and the potential tension about this. And Graham was asking about conservation areas, whether the conservation area consent control is enhancing or inhibiting the pace of adaptation and mitigation in the city.
Okay, thank you very much. Some good comments coming in there. So let's now turn to what people can do, people and communities getting organized. What does all this mean really for residents and businesses of the city, especially those that live, as many people do in Edinburgh, in traditional tenements and houses? What can people expect over the next few years, Adam?
Well, to use a hugely overdone cliche, the only constant is change, and the only constant that people are going to have over the next 10 years is a lot of change, more change than any of us have ever lived through before, because the circumstances demand it of us. And you know, the way our city looks, some of the things that were talked about by Fiona, I completely agree with in terms of the positive impact that some of these changes can have on our lives and on our place and on our space. But it is going to require a lot of, well, all of us to go along with that level of change. And that's about how we get around the city. It's about how we heat our homes. It's about how we replace a roof when it goes kaput, and what we look at in terms of our buildings. And we need to think of things very differently. We need to think of things in a far longer term way. Some interesting stats around this. If you go and put solar panels on your roof just now, and particularly if you get a loan which is 0% interest from the government, by the council's 2030 target, you'll have not only saved a whole heap of carbon in that time, you'll have actually paid off the solar panels that are on top of your roof. So while the next 10 years will feel, I think in some ways quite dramatic for a lot of people in terms of the amount of change that we're asking people to sign up to live through, to go with us through, actually, when you start thinking about some of the interventions we can take now and put them in a 10-year framework to when we really want to be a net zero city, and when I think the planet demands that we're a net zero city, because if places like Edinburgh can't do it by 2030, then other places will struggle by the dates that we need them to as an entire planet. We need to be driving that innovation, and there will be that help from our centres of climate centre innovation and the universities, and the Climate Commission will try and help spread that innovation across the city, but there's no getting away from that level of change. And I think when people look at the next 10 years, while to me it doesn't feel like a very long way away to hit that kind of target, actually is quite a long way away when you think about how many interventions an office block could have on their building to make themselves net zero, or any one of our houses, or any one of us taking the decision in the next 10 years to ditch the car and get an e-bike. And that's, in that context, 10 years actually, for a whole host of things that we can do now and are not reliant on further technological advancements, they're at our fingertips, and they can not only be done in the next 10 years, some of them can be paid for in the next 10 years.
I mean, as a heritage charity, we're keen to see the far less traffic in the city centre. We're one of the few World Heritage Sites in the world where you have major arteries travelling through what is one of the world's great historic environments. How committed do you think the city is to radical reduction of traffic in the centre of the city?
I think very. When the council put out the city centre transformation for consultation, it got a very large response. I think 4,500 people responded to that consultation. The vast majority of people want to see significant change. And when these kind of results are often dismissed by those who have a political agenda to oppose them, and that's fine, that's their right, that's between them and their ballot box, I suppose. but I think there's a huge appetite for change in this city. I think the 525,000 people who live here understand the direct connection between the actions we have to take and the future that we need to leave the next generation and generations after that. So I think there's a huge appetite across the city. Before COVID, one of the last things I did actually just before we went into lockdown was went and spoke at a church in the south of the city on climate change on a Saturday afternoon. And it was absolutely packed with people who were interested in the subject and who crucially wanted to understand not only what it meant for them, but how they could help drive that kind of change. So I think there's an enormous amount that we can do and an enormous amount of people in the city that are willing to go with us on it.
Anna, pick up that theme then from Adam in terms of what people can do and what can they expect from organisations like yours over the next few years, and what they can do, especially people who may be living in rented accommodation. They may not be homeowners.
Yeah, thank you. So actually really pleased to be working with Jan and colleagues at Edinburgh World Heritage who have just begun work to carry out a climate risk assessment for the World Heritage site. And I know they would be really pleased to hear from members and residents who might like to get involved in that, to really drill down to actually how are people who are living in the World Heritage site being affected by climate change? What are some of the actions that we can take both individually and also as organisations to increase resilience? So I think it's really important that we understand the science around how climate's changing, what it means for different building materials, but it's really important that we understand how this is affecting people and businesses. And I think that project led by yourselves at Edinburgh World Heritage is a really important opportunity. I know that Jan and the team will be working really hard to arrange different opportunities for people to share their views and input to that process. And that will just mean that the actions that are taken to adapt to climate change are really rooted in people's experience and tackle some of the big issues that we've discussed around shared maintenance of tenements, around actually there being some issues like drainage, which are beyond the scope of individual householders to actually deal with a lot of the time, that require a collective response. That lots of people I've seen on the chat have mentioned green infrastructure, like green walls, green roofs, more green space. Sounds brilliant. How do we make that happen? How do we kind of actually, there's some creativity and innovation and design and needed. And I think that's, that this project that Jan and you guys are leading will be really important.
Thank you. We didn't expect the plug, but thank you very much indeed. Ewan, your briefs across Scotland, how are you seeing Edinburgh versus other cities, historic cities in Scotland as well, in terms of how far we are in getting ready for this?
I think there's a huge amount going on across Scotland, as there is internationally, and there's a lot of lessons to learn from what's happening in other places. And I just wanted to come back to buildings really. And one thing that we're constantly trying to reinforce the message is what we term a fabric first approach, and that's for energy efficiency as well. And it's really before you, for want of a better phrase, green your building, think about how you can best reduce your environmental impact through energy efficiency first. How can you secure the resilience of your building first against climate impacts? And that comes down to basic things like maintenance. And I will talk about maintenance forever, because it's such an important first line in defense for slowing down the rate of decay. It's the most cost-effective way of keeping your building in good condition. It's the most cost-effective way of reducing carbon, because a dry building is an energy efficient building. And it's about that cautious approach, rather than throwing solar panels, for example, or expensive renewable energy. Get your property in order first through simple maintenance approach. It's like brushing your teeth. A little bit of time and resource invested every day, saves problems in the long run. So building maintenance is exactly the same.
We want to get through a few more questions, so let's pick up the pace a little bit if we can. A lot of comments are coming through about people who are renting their accommodation, and what can people who are in tenements, who are renting, can do. where there's a lot of passion and desire, issues with absentee landlords, Airbnbs, etc., etc. Would anyone like to comment on that issue?
I mean, I'm happy to. So in terms of the rented property, realistically, the regulations are going to have to shift in that in the next 10 years. We can't ignore commercial lets, whether it's for residential market or anywhere else. So that has to be the mechanism of how we get there. If you don't have an owner occupier with a vested interest, I suppose, in those kind of transformations, then it's going to have to be done by the regulation. A lot of that sits out with council. A lot of that would sit at a national level, but over the next 10 years, I would be absolutely dumbfounded if we didn't have much stronger regulation for that market, because it's going to be absolutely essential if we're, as a country, going to get to where we need to get to. The thing at an individual level is much more about how people go about their day-to-day lives. So Energy Saving Trust has very things about, well, what temperature do you keep your property at? And I'm a bit of a either warm-blooded or cold-blooded, depending on how you look at it, and keep my building degrees, which is unusually low for most people, and I appreciate that's too low for most people, but for me it's balmy. I was born for a reason, I always think. So there's things like that people can do, but other than that, it's about looking at how you get around the city. Someone that's renting is still going around the city having the same journeys. Right. Are they walking? Are they cycling? Are they taking public transport? It's those day-to-day decisions that actually still make up an enormous amount of carbon, and nobody wants people walking around feeling the guilt of somebody else's decisions. We're all responsible for ourselves in this, and we all work as a collective. But I think there's a huge amount people can do as an individual basis, and Saving Trust and other groups like that have some fantastic advice for people, both in their home and getting about.
Thank you. Let's just turn to the public realm. Fiona Rankin, I'm going to ask, who's an expert in this area in terms of our parks and gardens and streets and pathways, open spaces. I mean, these are crucial in terms of our response to the climate emergency. What role do you see for public realm in the response?
I think we have a head start on a lot of cities in that Edinburgh has more green space than any other city in the UK. We also have more trees than we have more people. So the existing designs of our cities has allowed for really good parks right throughout the city, well spread, and these are really important because they will help as the global temperature goes up. These will act as heat sinks and they'll really help to keep the city cool. So whenever we build new developments, for instance, I think it's really important that they also are designed with green space around them, plenty new trees. I know we have an aspiration to get up to 1 million trees. I think we're around 700,000 at the moment. So new tree planting, making sure that we keep our parks and gardens in good condition with biodiversity, also really important for well-being. We know, for instance, that children who can see trees from their homes or from their schools actually achieve higher educational results. So we're beginning to understand the importance then of green space to well-being as well as its role in the climate. But apart from that, we can also adapt the planting as time goes on to make it more resilient, better able to act as a sort of sink for storing water. We can create rain gardens, for instance, where this excess surface water can actually be held and use the green space in that way. Generally, the public realm will be a really important place. If we make the public realm really wonderful, really appealing to people, then we will entice them out of their cars and get them walking.
Yeah, it's a very, very comprehensive answer. Did anyone else have any comments? Are we in agreement on that? I mean, the importance of parks and gardens. Any other thoughts on the role that the public realm plays in Edinburgh in terms of our climate response? No? Okay, so we'll head over to Jan now and see what's been happening with the Q&A. Jan, over to you.
Yep, thanks, Nick. Again, we received a lot of comments and questions. Thanks to our attendees for that. Most of the questions were relating to the buildings and basically how people could receive help in order to make sure the buildings are more efficient and the historic buildings are more efficient. There were questions about, what are the best materials, the right technologies, whether heat pumps are relevant or not in historic buildings. Was something Richard mentioned that was really interesting and is happening in Vienna, and they've got similar housing model types as in Edinburgh. So they've got also tenements, and the city developed a scheme in order to install community PV power stations in the city center, in the historic center. So that's interesting, and it could be an idea for Edinburgh to look at what's been done or what is being done in other cities and historic cities. We also had a lot of questions, and I think quite attention on the windows, for example. And Ewan asks what can be done to lower heat losses from buildings in the new town, for instance, given there are strict regulations about fitting double glazed windows.
Yeah, so that's a good question. It's a difficult one, that balance between conservation and energy efficiency. Fiona, what can be done with drafty Newtown windows?
There's actually plenty that can be done. The very first thing you can do is have your window draft proof. We've even had lessons on how you can do it yourself. It's not that complicated. The sash and case windows are beautifully designed so that you can take them out quite easily. And if you put draft seals all the way around, you will actually find a significant difference. And as well as that, you can try and get your shutters working again, or install shutters if you haven't got them. They actually prevent quite a lot of heat loss. Curtains, roller blinds, the same. These are all the first things you can do. And then after that, you take a step up and you can install secondary glazing, which is another window on the inside. Now, sometimes that's tricky to do, but there's a lot of new types out, including a magnetic type that just fits very closely against your existing window. And if your windows are in extremely poor condition, it is possible to fit new timber double glazed windows in exceptional circumstances, admittedly. But there is now the ability to make very, very slim double glazed windows which don't alter the appearance to extreme away. Okay. So there's a lot of choices there.
Thank you. So we're pretty much out of time. So thank you to our panelists. I think that was a great conversation. I'm just going to hand over to Christina, now our new Director of Edinburgh World Heritage, who's taken over from Adam Wilkinson, to thank our panelists.
Yes, thanks, Nick. And what a fantastic discussion. Our very sincere thanks to our speakers. It was great to have such expertise and also diversity of perspectives in the virtual room relating to this issue. We at Edinburgh World Heritage, and I'm sure everyone at home, very much appreciate your time and your input into an important discussion for both our heritage and our collective response to the climate emergency. Looking at the time, I won't talk for too long, but one particular thing that struck me was how much we are all singing off the same hymn sheet in terms of the overall result that we want to achieve, and the very clear benefits of getting everyone around the table with their various expertise and input to really find a solution that works fundamentally and is bespoke to the particular conditions and Edinburgh's unique historic character, which of course is an asset in its own right. So I hope you at home all found it enriching and engaging, Nick will now leave you with some information on our upcoming events.
Yes, thank you, Christina. Just time to tell you that we're just about to launch our autumn series of online events to celebrate Edinburgh's role as inspiration to great artists and writers. So it's entitled My Own Romantic Town, in honour of Edinburgh and Walter Scott, and is a series in our special guests will share their favourite examples of Edinburgh literature, art, sculpture, and discuss why the city has an enduring appeal to the creative soul. We're delighted that in Rankin, sculptor Sally Stoddart, watercolourist Hugh Buchanan, art festival director Sarah Carey have all agreed to be part of the series, together with a whole lineup of curators, academics, and Edinburgh experts. So we'll look forward very much to seeing you then. Goodbye.